I guess before I start, just like to get some feeling, how much do people know about the task force and its recommendations? Because I've got, as usual, always too much to say, and it's just a matter of what I can skim over and what I... just hands up if you feel you're reasonably familiar with the recommendations of the task force. So it's about half. Sorry?
A bit.
Yeah, okay, so I better go over them a bit. So those who know will just have to eat their lunches and things. I'll start off with a disclaimer. I was a member of the task force, and that ceased to exist when its report was published in April. So I cannot and do not claim to represent the task force or its members, and so anything I say here, unless I explicitly quote it, is you can assume to be my own views. So what I want to do is just to introduce the background of the task force and a bit about it, talk a bit about some of its more significant findings in a kind of a more general way rather than being too specific. As I say, there's an awful lot of material to cover here, and so I can only really pick and choose a bit. Then I'll go quickly through its recommendations and end up really on what has been done and some of my comments about what the government has decided to do. So the task force was set up with the background of the Pipe River tragedy very much in the mind of both the government and the country. Its terms of reference, among other things, stated that it was 20 years since the Health and Safety Employment Act 1992 had been enacted, which Jeff has just mentioned, and 10 years since the last significant review. So it was actually whatever over time for a review of the legislation. And then it said, I'm quoting here from the terms of reference, New Zealand has relatively poor rates of work-related fatality when compared with other countries with similar health and safety frameworks, notably Australia and the United Kingdom, and the trends in our official rates of fatality and serious injury are not improving. Now, I suggest that was probably an understatement, but it also underlines one of the issues that we came up hard against during the inquiry. What we do know, and I think these are reasonable approximations to the truth, that around 1 in 10 workers is harmed every year. If you look only at ACC claims, with 200,000 being made to ACC for costs associated with work-related injuries and illnesses. Of course, ACC doesn't necessarily cover every injury that occurs or every occupational disease that is suffered. 60 to 90 over the last 10 years, workers are killed as a result of injuries suffered at work. And this is injuries. About 5 times that number. Sometimes are seriously injured, and an estimated 500 to 800 people die prematurely from occupational illness. So while we tend to focus quite understandably on injury, occupational illness is the bottom of the iceberg that people really talk about, but desperately needs to be addressed. Now, I mentioned that these figures and plenty of others became a real issue during the course of the deliberations of the inquiry, and in fact, you'll see that if you read the report, you'll find that by the end we were so unsure of our figures that we were unable to actually make some definite statements about international comparisons and about some of these figures on numbers killed and so on. And that's because our statistics are in a horrible mess. Statistics New Zealand did a sterling job at the beginning of this year to try and fix them. There are still gaps in them. The occupational disease area is still a mess, and we have terrible lack of information and the contextual information around this data to enable us to actually understand where, why, who this is happening to, and what we can do in order to reduce it. So that is just one of the elements of the awful state of our health and safety system, if you think of it as a system. The task force itself consisted of 6 members and a very able secretariat, and one of the members of the secretariat is in the audience. Thank you, Paul. We unanimously decided to take that word independent very seriously, and so while obviously there were influences on us, we tried our best to do what we thought was right rather than what we knew the pressures would be. Inevitably in these things there is a compromise there, but I think that what we came out with was something that was a significant advance on where we are. There's always more that governments can do, and I'm sure there'll be urgings for future governments to do more, but I think what the recommendations came up to were a real step change. We were helped very much by the Pike River Royal Commission reporting midway through our deliberations. It provided a very strong platform for our recommendations. We undertook consultation very seriously, and in fact had our time extended from its original deadline in order to make sure that consultation was done properly. We did it in 3 stages. Firstly, meetings with key stakeholders in 4 groups: academics, employers, workers and inspectors. Secondly, a round of public meetings right throughout the country, of various sorts of meetings, and then we had written submissions, and we also talked on various occasions to relevant government agencies and to experts in the field. We commissioned some research, and those reports are available on the Health and Safety Task Force website, and of course we made recommendations in the report. The report itself is in 2 parts, and I've got a few spare copies here if anyone wants to grab one. Good reading, I recommend it to you. There's an executive report for those who want to cheat. I would discourage you from cheating. And there's the main report, which has a lot of detail, and some of that I draw on today. 4 parts to it. There's a foreword with a description of the failures and description of the submissions that were made and some case studies and so on, and where we want to go. There's part 2 is kind of the guts of it with the recommendations. There's a cost-benefit analysis and implementation plan in part 3, and then there are appendices which are separate from that volume. Those appendices largely come from reports from research and from the submissions that were made. So the findings, and as I say, this is a fairly general look at it, but I think it's quite useful to look at it in this way because it kind of puts into the kind of context actually that Jeff set about our regulatory structures here in New Zealand. The task force, and I'm quoting here directly, the task force has found that there is no single critical factor behind our poor health and safety record. Rather, our workplace health and safety system has a number of significant weaknesses that need to be addressed if we are to achieve the major step change in performance that we as a nation should demand. Regrettably, there is no silver bullet, and a piecemeal approach will not suffice. To the contrary, it is our firm conviction that the government must adopt the full range of recommendations made in this report if we are to deliver the outcomes that all working New Zealanders deserve. Now, this is, in a phrase, a systemic problem. This is not one thing here, one thing there, or they can talk about whole things that went wrong, but it's a systemic problem. There's the task forces. If there's one aspect of it that you can isolate, you can point to that kind of sums up that systemic problem, it's this. And it's about Robens. And for those of you not familiar with Robens, I'll talk about that in a minute. But it is the task force view, again I'm quoting, that weaknesses across the system are the direct result of a fundamental failure to implement properly the Robens health and safety model in New Zealand. The plethora of issues arising from this factor alone are across the system, multiple, persistent and compounding. Now Robens, if you don't know, is kind of the messiah of health and safety systems, if you like. And a report that he headed a committee in the early 1970s in the UK, and the report that he headed and published in 1972 is kind of if you're talking about messiahs, I guess the Bible, it's constantly referred back to because of the way it looked at the in general terms, the kinds of approaches that were taken internationally to health and safety at that point, and how to change those to make them manageable in an increasingly complex world. So essentially, one of the first, I guess, I mean, the people here know more about regulatory theory and history, like Brian up there, than I do, but I would imagine it's probably one of the first performance-based models of regulation. And we talk about that these days as self-regulation or light-handed regulation, and they can be highly problematic. But this one has been highly successful in many countries, and particularly in the UK where it originated, which is one of the lowest health and safety, one of the lowest fatality rates and injury rates, serious injury rates in the world. If you could, depending on how you measure these things. But it has been by I think common agreement, one of the most successful in managing its workplace health and safety. But it rests on a number of pillars. Firstly, a strong regulator, one that is knowledgeable about what it does and has the resources and the personnel and the political backing as well to enforce the rules. That's a matter of capability and capacity. It's about resources, it's about knowledge, it's about its standing in the community. Secondly, while there is this general, the legislation is general about performance, it assumed a very strong underpinning of regulation and guidance that's quite often quite prescriptive, that gives more certainty to those affected, so both employers and employees, and is a way of conveying good practice into as many areas as you can. So this is not simply a self-regulatory, deregulatory model. It is about a balance and doing it in a way that is flexible enough so it can change reasonably easily with time. And the third pillar of it, and this in itself is kind of a three-legged stool, is this idea of tripartism. That there are actually three important actors in the workplace. One is the government as regulator. The second is the employer. And the third are workers there represented by the unions. And I say represented by the unions, not simply workers, because workers on their own are heavily subject to the will of employers and in this general sense not organised in a way to actually represent themselves other than through some kind of body like a union. And so that was quite fundamental, and if you look at, for example, the governing body of the Health and Safety Executive in the UK, which is the independent agency that looks after these things, it's got an explicit tripartite structure with representatives on the board from those three parts of society. That structure recognises and is designed around the reality of workplaces. Robens himself was a former trade unionist. He was Lord Robens, so he'd somehow got kept upstairs into the House of Lords. But he was very well aware of the realities of the workplace. And this reflected, I'm talking here essentially about the power relationships in the workplace. And this isn't simply theory, it was reflected very clearly in the Royal Commission and then by the task force and in many other inquiries into these kinds of incidents and events. The Royal Commission said the Commission considers that as at November 2010 when the disaster occurred, the emphasis placed on short-term coal production so seriously weakened height safety culture that signs of the risk of an explosion either went unnoticed or not heeded. The task force said many businesses prioritise production targets over health and safety concerns, and went on, Employees often lack awareness of their rights, and if they are aware, fear reprisals if they exercise them. It was one of the startling things that I experienced going around those public meetings, that people from quite unexpected workplaces were saying people don't report incidents, don't report potential health and safety risks because they're afraid to. Now these are all reflections of that power balance in the workplace, and unless you recognise that, you will continue to have this kind of situation where people do not participate sufficiently in their own health and safety, and the balance that's required between the prerogatives of production or profit, if you want to put it in naked terms, and that safety of workers will continue to be a problem. So tripartism is a built-in balance vital to self-regulating workplaces and this kind of regulatory or self-regulatory system or deregulatory system, performance-based system. And this tripartism is actually recognised in international conventions as the appropriate way to go through the International Labour Organisation. So what in fact happened in this 1992 Health and Safety and Employment Act, and I'm not resting blame simply on that 1992, the government that was in place in 1992, but this continued on through a succession of governments right through to the present time virtually. There was no independent regulator put in place. Because there's no independent regulator, there was no tripartite structure in its governance. Neither was there any tripartite participation in the actual administration of the regulator in terms of designing regulations and codes of practice, of guidance, all those things that need to go on constantly. Nor was there any in workplaces. There was no provision for the participation of workers in their own health and safety. It was underfunded, as many things were during the 1990s, and you only need to think about Cave Creek as a very detailed, a documented example of that. So enforcement was underfunded, both in terms of capacity and having enough inspectors to do it, and in terms of their skills and their relevance to the particular workplaces they were inspecting, and indeed into the political backing for that. There was a continual pressure to reduce regulatory behaviour. The decision was made in the mid-90s not to create those underpinning regulations. The Employment Contracts Act and structural changes to the economy, the opening up of the economy and the huge changes in industrial structure in New Zealand led to a halving or more actually of union membership and increased casual short-term employment, which is not only hard for unions to organise, but was actually hard to organise in a health and safety sense. And at the same time, industry training changes decimated training, so apprentices became relatively rare. There's certainly far fewer of them, and the health and safety knowledge that was a very important part of that kind of training went with it. I'm not trying to gild the lily here. There were lots of problems with that industry training system, but nothing was put in place to replace that aspect of it. Just as an example, this is really not to say that correlation means causation, but it's rather graphic. It comes from the Pike River Royal Commission report. This is the number of minerals and coal inspections between 1991 to 1997 in the top graph. And as you see, it steadily fell off during the 90s, largely as a result of lack of resourcing for that inspectorate. And as you see in the bottom, serious harm frequency rates in mining accordingly rise. And this is, you could put that, there may be other factors here, of course. I think the end result suggests that probably not, but certainly there is literature to the effect that funding is actually very important in these kinds of systems. So you can see this as another failure of light-handed regulation. I quote from the report, the task force report again: the model of occupational health and safety regulation implemented through the Health and Safety and Employment Act in the early 1990s may be seen as an object lesson in how not to implement legislation. There were some attempts to fix some of these things up, particularly in the 2000s. Worker participation scheme was introduced in the legislation in 2002, but as the report says, has proved too often ineffective and often virtually absent. Good intentions, but really didn't work for a number of reasons. A tripartite workplace health and safety council was formed in 2007, but it had no executive powers, no resources, and as the task force and the Park River Commission agreed, and they're quoting here back to Robens once again, so there's some echoes over the years here. As Robens concluded 40 years ago, advisory committees have little influence. An executive board is required if there's to be effective participation in decision making. So, what were the recommendations as a result of the wide range of findings that I've just skirted over? The report looks at three different areas. Firstly, about accountability, so that's mainly about the regulatory and institutional settings. Secondly, about motivation, so that's about enforcement, about both penalties and incentives. And finally, in knowledge. So this is about both guidance to people in the workplace, but also research, data, investigation, review, all those things. What I'll go through here is the top level recommendations. There's several levels of more detailed recommendations in the body of the report, but I'm quite happy to talk about those in response to questions. And I'll skip over these, I hope, quite quickly, because I don't want to spend too much time on these, but by all means do ask questions about them. So firstly, the task force recommended a new workplace health and safety agency, which had also been recommended by the Park River Commission earlier. And it recommended it should be a Crown agent. There was some debate there about how independent it should be. The Crown agent was the least independent, but was a trade-off for having policy functions. The new agency should be constituted on a tripartite basis, and you know the story there, with independent chair, and it actually recommended in the detail 2 members representing appointed in consultation with the peak bodies of both unions and employers, to each of those, and one from iwi, and then others with expertise in the system, all of them with a primary requirement to be looking after the health and safety system rather than to their constituencies, if you like. But the idea was this would be a body of experts who would be respected for for their background as much as for their position. And the new agency should have a primary responsibility for workplace harm prevention, including strategy and implementation. So it should be the foremost body there that people would say would recognise as the authoritative centre of government in this area, not just regulation but advice, education and many other things. Secondly, that it should enact a new Workplace Health and Safety Act based on the Australian model law. The Australian model law was developed just over the last 2 or 3 years after long debate in Australia, and is considered as a kind of state-of-the-art statement of Robens, taking into account the kind of workplaces we have now, where there are all these different forms of work, casualised, labour hire, contracting, whole chains of contractors down the chain, rather than just straight employment relationships. And I'll just point out a couple of things. That duties should extend to all relationships between those in control of workplaces and those who are affected through adopting the Australian approach of a PCBU. The Australians call these peekaboos. This means person controlling a business or undertaking. It's a more generalised concept than employer, and it means that if you are if you're Fletcher's, for example, and you're and control a construction site, and you contract with a number of contractors to carry out that work, and they in turn contract with other contractors to carry out their work, then this applies to all of you, and there's no lessened responsibility simply because you're at the top or in the middle or the bottom of that chain. Everybody there has responsibility. It's a very powerful concept. It should extend to the governance roles, and I'll talk about that a bit later, and should have a stronger test of what of the obligation on on people to carry out their obligations, to carry out their responsibilities under the Act. So it's a significant shift towards the safety, balancing the safety of workers rather than the cost of taking actions needed. It's significantly strengthened the legal framework for, the recommendation was to strengthen the legal framework for worker participation through obligations on the peekaboos to supply worker to support it. There was expanded powers and responsibilities worker health and safety representatives who currently exist but really have insufficient powers, and stronger protections for workers who raise matters regarding workplace health and safety. And a number of other things I won't go into here in detail, but essentially a lot of these things would need to be described through codes of practice. Much stronger alignment and coordination of workplace health and safety activities through the various government agencies that are present in the workplace health and safety. So, two I mentioned here, hazardous substances and noxious organisms, the HESNO Act, currently, which is the responsibility of the Environment Protection Authority and the Ministry for the Environment. The idea was that the actual workplace part of that would be done through this new agency. There's obviously common ground with ACC, and the concept there was that the new agency would receive funding that currently comes through from ACC to that the ACC currently gets for injury prevention activities, and for the primary focus of those injury prevention activities be around the workplace health and safety, from that workplace health and safety view, rather than from the ACC view, which tends to be about claim reduction rather than necessarily a focus on the most important aspects of harm. There are a number of bodies in the transport area which all impact on workplaces that the transport sectors. So there's civil aviation, there's Maritime New Zealand that looks after shipping, there's New Zealand Police who look after commercial vehicles, and NZTA, which also has some role in commercial vehicles but particularly also has responsibility for rail. And the idea here was that we needed consistency in the approach taken by all of these organisations, and that would be done through a service level agreement from the new agency, which is now called WorkSafe, so I'll refer to it as WorkSafe. That they would be led by WorkSafe through service level agreements that specify them the kinds of interventions they make, the kinds of strategies they take, and the kind of services that they provide in that area. So there's a tightly coordinated system, but we still make use of the expertise and the other functions, that these kind of agencies have. Significantly strengthen the regulation of occupational health, and the main thing here was giving the agency that responsibility, but also giving it the money to set up an occupational health unit within the agency. strengthen the regulatory regime for managing the risks of major hazard facilities. So currently this is mainly about mining and petroleum exploration, but what we said was there's actually a whole lot of other areas we need to look at. Anything from an ammonia plant that's sitting in a reasonably well built up area, or even a university lab that may have quite significant potential implications for workers' health and safety or neighbours' health and safety, but also things that people don't think about so much, such as a large entertainment space, such as the Westpac Sports Arena, where if a catastrophe happened, there would be potentially thousands of people at risk. Recommending that the government sets an example in 2 or 3 ways. The main ones, firstly, in public health campaigns, if you like, rather like the anti-smoking campaigns. But secondly, that the agencies, all the agencies of government, set an example in their health and safety standards and behaviour. And thirdly, that government procurement be used as a lever to improve the standards of health and safety in all their suppliers. That could be potentially a very significant way for government to influence quite directly the private sector. And under the motivating levers, the implementing measures for through ACC levies. Firstly, through a form of experience rating, I guess, but one that makes much more use of lead indicators, so emphasises much more preventative activities rather than simply looking at claims history. And the importance of that for us is that there are many adverse side effects potentially from emphasising claims as a way to design discounts into a scheme like that. And also a star rating type scheme, or a health and safety rating type scheme. To look at corporate manslaughter, the Ministry of Justice was asked to do that. Stronger penalties for affected and visible work compliance activity. In the knowledge area, build up this series of regulations and codes of practice that were significantly lacking under the previous regime. And improve the quality of data and information. And it required there a number of mandates to require or obtain information or cooperate with other agencies to obtain that information. And one of the important areas of that is obviously in the health system. There are many issues around that in terms of privacy and confidentiality, but the health system, among others, is one of the ones that potentially could provide rich information for further activities to reduce workplace injuries, but also particularly workplace disease. The workforce development strategy, one of the things we identified was not only in the regulator itself and government, but also in the workforce in general. There's a huge lack of the kind of knowledge and skills that are required to improve our health and safety, to give proper advice to employers, for employers to rely on that advice and so on. One of the specific recommendations there is to establish a Health and Safety Professionals Alliance and the development of a pathway to the occupational regulation or registration of health and safety practitioners. Ensure that the new agency's compliance activity is focused on harm prevention with much greater emphasis placed on root cause analysis. So this is about, if you like, no blame investigations, much more attention to investigation and to review of what has occurred in the past. There's a section there on cost benefit, so that's really the main recommendations. Sorry to rush through them quickly, but we can come back to them if you want. Cost benefit analysis was done, estimated that the new agency would require something like 100 million in ongoing funding per year. This would increase the inspector ratio, which was a very significant issue, I've got 1 to 1.07, I think it should be 10,000 to 1.07, is that right? So that would increase it from something like 150 approved at the moment, and in fact significantly less than that, to 180. But that doesn't include those engaged in major hazards, the major hazard unit, and also in the occupational health unit. They're not necessarily inspectors, but they're providing the backing that those inspectors require. Strong occupational health unit, and there was some calculation done of the compliance costs to firms, which turned out to be very low, and of a bit of a cost-benefit analysis. If you value lives in the usual way, you only have to save 10 to 15 lives in order to pay for the additional costs there. But if you include injuries as well, then actually it doesn't take very much to actually pay for these kinds of costs. So what has actually been done? Well, the government has recently announced the acceptance of the vast bulk of these recommendations, and that is a very significant step forward, and I think the government is to be congratulated on it. It really is a step change in the health and safety system in New Zealand. So that includes establishing this new agency, WorkSafe. An establishment board has been set up with 5 members, including people nominated from the CTU and Business New Zealand. There is an acting chief executive who's, I think, in place as from this week, Geoffrey Podger, who's the retiring chief executive of the UK Health and Safety Executive, which is, to my mind, a brilliant appointment. He is only acting, so they'll be looking for a permanent person for that position. The new agency will be in place by the 1st of December. Funding has been announced for it. It will include a new occupational health unit. Announced that a new act will be put in place based on the Australian Model Act, as pretty well as I described, to be introduced by December and passed by the end of next year. It includes, as I mentioned, significantly increased powers for inspectors, for health and safety representatives, and increased penalties, and generally stronger provisions for worker participation and protection for workers who want to report matters. There's work going on to design and promulgate regulations, approved codes of practice, that's ACOPS, and guidance. That work has already started, and there's a very significant program required to do that. It's a huge piece of work, requires significant resourcing, but that has started and is underway, and there's been clear bipartite involvement in that being signalled, and we're working. CTU has been working with MB at this point on that. A workplace health and safety strategy will be put in place, a new one. It will be owned by the Minister, advised by MB, WorkSafe and other agencies, and includes this idea of a workforce development strategy. There'll be some cross-government action and collaboration. This coordination between agencies that I mentioned on hazardous substances with the EPA and the Ministry of the Environment, and between MB, WorkSafe and ACC. And I'll talk about those a bit more in a minute. There's some work on these incentives, firstly on a star rating scheme that basically gives businesses a rating as to their health and safety standards that they can then use potentially for areas like government procurement and in terms of just their reputation. Experience ratings, which is currently in place under ACC is currently being evaluated by Treasury, MB and ACC. Again, I'll come back to that. The Ministry of Justice is considering the issue of corporate liability, and MB, before the WorkSafe gets underway, because it won't be underway for at the earliest end of the year, but really has to do a lot of work to just get up and running, is undertaking some work until that new agency is set up. So those are all good things, and I'm going to go now to some of my concerns, but I'll just reiterate that I think, despite these concerns, that is a really a major step forward. My main concerns here are as follows. The WorkSafe board is not tripartite. It's not in legislation. It is under legislation, it only requires perspectives of workplace participants. The blueprint, a booklet put out by MB to describe the new system, talks about workers' perspectives, but there's nothing specific in there. In fact, as I said, CTU and Business New Zealand nominees are on the establishment board, but they are there by grace and favour rather than as of right, and it's very difficult for people in that position to take a strong position on things, and at times that will need to be taken if they feel that their positions are simply there by grace of the Minister. Instead, the board is going to be heavier with cross-board representatives, so there's going to be representatives from the ACC board and the Environment Protection Agency board on it, and the more that happens, the more that those tripartite representatives are kind of submerged in a much larger board. There are, however, these tripartite mechanisms at a lower level, designing the regulations and the codes of practice and guidance and so on. So it's kind of truncated in a sense. But still, this is a very important issue. And again, as I say, in the UK, this is a model that's worked very well. The Australian system, the federal system, has a similar tripartite model. Secondly, WorkSafe didn't receive the funding that was recommended. And I worked in universities for 26 years. I've worked with lots of public sector organisations, and we all complain about not enough money. But actually, I think in this kind of context, this is absolutely critical, and the history of it makes that very, very obvious. That if you underfund it, you're going to get more injuries, you're going to get more harm, you're going to get more deaths. So I'm worried that the underfunding, and we won't really see the results of this for some time, but the underfunding is not sufficient for what was recommended by the task force. It's $80 million a year instead of the 95 to 100 million, 95 million next year that was recommended, 100 million in kind of a steady state, about 2016. That I guess 80% doesn't sound too bad. It's actually, in terms of the difference between what was there before and what was recommended in terms of the increase in funding, is quite significant. It may not show quickly because because WorkSafe does have some time to ramp up, but it has to recruit. I mean, one of the big costs will be getting good people there, and it does have to take time to do that recruitment. But that really does need to be reviewed. They talked about reviewing it at the end of 2015. I really hope that they do. Funding in this sense is reasonably easy. It's funded through the Health and Safety and Employment Levy, which is a tiny wee levy that kind of disappears into the much bigger ACC levy. It's given a rise from 5 cents to 9 cents, and the average levy is something like around $1. So, and it's actually coming, the ACC levy itself is actually coming down at the moment. So it's actually a good time to make sure that we fund this properly. Third main concern here is that WorkSafe does not have the clear leadership role that it was, that the recommendation very deliberately gave to it. And the question there is, can it carry out its role strongly and fearlessly in the situation that it has been placed in? And I just go through here a number of aspects of that. So firstly, MB is responsible for regulations. So there's two main types of sort of secondary or tertiary statute here, if you like. So there's regulations, and then there's codes of practice, which also have some standing in courts, and under that there's guidance, which is has lesser standing. The original concept was that all of those should be the prime responsibility of this agency. Instead, that's been split between MB and in consultation on technical matters with WorkSafe, with WorkSafe only having the codes of practice. Secondly, MB retains a very heavy policy role, advising the Minister on legislation, regulations as we've seen in other matters. WorkSafe has some policy role, which is good, but it's largely an operational policy role. It will have some room to move there, but really I think that gives it a secondary role in this area. MB, and this isn't really part of this leadership issue, but I think it's a very important context. MB also monitors WorkSafe. All Crown agents have a department that monitors them. MB monitors it, and the Minister has considerable control of WorkSafe because a Crown agent is of that nature. With a Crown agent, the Minister can dismiss members of the board at any time, can give it much more directive directions than it can, for example, a autonomous or independent Crown agent, and so we'll have significantly more control there. ACC, if we look at ACC, retains most of the funding for injury prevention for workplace health and safety. WorkSafe can access that jointly with ACC, but it must report to the ACC board on the effectiveness of that spending and so on. And that money must be in accord with the legislation, ACC's legislation, which says that all expenditure on injury prevention must have the eventual outcome of reducing levies, which very much focuses it on claims rather than on what might be your injury, your harm prevention strategies in the wider sense. And there's been a problem in the past. ACC also controls the incentive schemes, such as the star rating and the experience rating schemes. WorkSafe's role, it must work jointly with WorkSafe only on injury prevention aspects of this, but in the Cabinet papers, for example, there's no acknowledgement that there are possible adverse side effects from particularly the experience rating for this. And in fact, even before this gets underway, ACC is just currently, as we speak, consulting on intensifying experience rating by increasing the discounts for employers who have a good claims history. But the whole idea, which was very important, of having lead indicators as part of these incentive scheme, of this type of incentive scheme, has been dropped, at least for now. And finally, in this area, WorkSafe has not been given direct influence over those transport agencies with workplace health and safety responsibilities. So that common approach, that's really quite essential to a consistent approach to this across the board. I'll just give you one example in that area of data. Stats New Zealand found that there were a number of deaths that had not been reported and weren't included in its statistics. Some of those came from MB, and it's now concluding those. Some of them came from CAA in Maritime New Zealand. And it seems extraordinary that that kind of lack of coordination in our system should occur. But there's all of these agencies that the announcement's been silent on, essentially. A number of others. There's a worrying emphasis at this early stage on easing compliance burden when employers should be really challenged to change at this stage. Regulations, these regulations will also be subject to Treasury's economics focused regulatory model, and I think when that meets these new measures of a greater emphasis on a greater weight being given to prevention of harm rather than cost, that there could well be a conflict there. There's no mention of the need to access health system data for research, for the health system for data and research, which I think is a crucial source of quality information, particularly for occupational health. There's only passing mention of improving support for hard-to-reach workers and employers. So these workers in this much more insecure workforce that we have, who are casualised or working for labour hire firms or contracted. There were submissions made and recommendations made on these, and they don't appear, except in passing, in the implementation plan. Worker participation, there's some very good stuff there, but the provisions in some areas are less specific than under the current Act. So, for example, under the current Act, all employers of more than 30 employees are required to have some form of health and safety representative system if requested. So they're going to rely heavily on a good code of practice being developed. And in the past that has been difficult, but we are hoping that it won't be as difficult now. And those workers, I think it has to be realised, that worker participation has to be recognised, will not be effective in many workplaces without effective union representation. Government procurement as a means to raise the performance of government contractors is largely on the back burner. As they say, it's waiting this star rating system being developed. I hope that's all it's waiting for, but really there could be work going on to develop that. And for government agencies, the focus will only be on the high risk or high hazard agencies, whereas the idea was that they would set an example to the rest of the community. And the high hazard regulation area doesn't mention these sites with low risk but potential high levels of injury or death, such as sports stadiums and other entertainment facilities. Whether that's because they figured that was covered in some other way, I'm not sure, but there's certainly no explanation of it. So just to finish up, what can you do as, and I'm interested in you largely as thinking of you coming from an academic background, but if you're from somewhere else, I can suggest things you can do too. As you have seen, there's a huge gap there in the research and just in the plain data, good data that needs to be played. And there's lots that can be done, and I hope will be done over the next few years in plugging those holes and providing that information base that will allow us to address the health and safety problems in a much more deliberative and effective way. Secondly, there were a significant number of recommendations that I've skirted over a bit about integration of health and safety into many more into education, right from early childhood through to the highest levels of tertiary education. There's both generic, and I'm talking here largely, of course, about university education because I guess that's what I'm talking to. But in a large number of courses, there needs to be generic knowledge for a lot more people. But there's also specialist areas, and occupational health is an area, for example, where we just don't have enough people with that kind of knowledge that's required. But I also think of areas like management, where one of the problems really that we have is that we just don't have good managers in New Zealand, and they need to have the skills to deal with these kinds of issues. And they're not simply about obeying the regulations, they're about the ways that you work with people and encourage them to participate and encourage them to report, to be honest about the workplace, to have no blame environments, those kinds of things. You can help in monitoring what's going on. Again, perhaps part of the research effort, but your independence gives you standing there. And finally, it can also take an active role in your own workplaces to make sure this is a safe environment. You may think universities are relatively safe places to work. Well, there are places, there are things like labs and I guess stores of chemicals and so on, but there are also places, as I know, where there are psychosocial hazards from bullying and other forms of social pressures, stress and other forms of social pressures. So you can look after yourselves as well. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So, thank you. Well, I think we'll have a few minutes for questions and discussion.
Well, thanks, Bill. That was a very, and much less than I thought it was going to be. Thank you for that really interesting overview. Couple of things. When Todd was on the ACC board, he tried to get it to shift to more prevention and brought out a lot of people from Sweden. I was staggered that they had no workplace deaths in Sweden, which was, 4 or 5 times the population for the last upton years. So we are really just another area where we're a terrible outlier. That's 30%. And I wonder, thinking about that international dimension, whether some organisation like the International Labour Organisation doesn't kind of embarrass us more about saying, why aren't you doing more? Because although there are directions that look like it's done well, it's still not, that organisation looks like it's not going to have the autonomy to be able to do what we need to be done, given how much ACC is being twisted and turned and bullied. So just the international dimension, and how can we actually put some, strengthening the backbone of that organisation so it can build for more?
Yeah, I don't really know enough about that. I mean, certainly there are international labour conventions and that govern things like requirements for good health and safety systems and tripartism and the kinds of systems that need to be set up in any country to ensure that these things are being addressed. And there'll be regular reporting on that, and so you could do something through that reporting process. They also are kind of a repository of some of the most important international databases comparing countries, and I guess what we found is even some of those are I guess rubbish in, rubbish out to a degree, but they are certainly very important in that sometimes it's only those international comparisons that tell us how badly or how well that we're doing. So I guess it's through those kinds of mechanisms that...
So the HRC tried to set up an occupational health network and collapsed after 15 years. So there's no, with some work done on Massey, there's a dearth of people doing work on the health sector.
Well, yeah. This mightn't be complete, but the ones I'm aware of, AUT is doing quite a bit of work there, yeah. Massey, and of course there's the Injury Prevention Research Unit at Otago in Dunedin. Yeah, which is kind of, it's relevant, but yeah. So yes, there's plenty of room there for more people to get involved, and from various aspects. And I think the obvious big gap is in that whole area of occupational health, really. But I think there's a lot of epidemiology type of stuff that I've got the right word there, just to understand the trends much better and be able to analyse the context of harm incidents so that we can understand much better what's going on.
Richard.
Richard Evans from Public Health. Thanks very much for the report. I just wondered if you could comment on the politics of the committee on the report process. It seems to me, I know you've got some concerns, but nevertheless it's been pretty successful. And in the context of the government, it perhaps is not very predisposed to increasing population and so on. Is there anything you can say about how you managed as a committee with the report to have such an impact?
Oh, sheer brilliance, of course. I think there's a number of factors there. Firstly, Pipe River. I mean, that's kind of an elephant that can't be ignored, isn't it? So that was obviously the immediate stimulus to setting up the task force. Secondly, of course, it was a task force set up by this government, and so really would have found it hard to ignore it. It was chaired by a very prominent businessman, Rob Jager, who the government has lots of connections with in other ways. He's also chair of the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. Again, a very difficult person to ignore, but someone who's actually extremely committed to this and would take things a lot further if he could, I think. So I guess it's a combination of factors. I mean, I'm biased, but I think the report was actually pretty persuasive. I mean, in any area like this, there's a lot of areas of evidence and data that you really can never come to a conclusion on, and certainly now the state of our data, it's very difficult to come to conclusions on. So I think, given all that, it was a persuasive report in terms of what did need to be done. And yeah, I guess that's what I'll come to. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Sarah.
There have been a number of estimates, and they range from about $1 billion a year, the cost of current harm. The figure we've used is $3.5 billion, and that's generally been accepted. But they range up to as much as $20 billion a year when you count all the social costs and so on. So it's not minor. But there are some of those, and there's O'Day from, he's retired from here. He did a lot of that work, so there are papers, and some of them referred to in the report there, that have tried to quantify those. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you think, in the context of the problems that have arisen out of the proliferation of agencies in other areas and the challenges that have come out of that, and you talked about transport as an example, do you think there will be similar challenges around the emergence of WorkSafe, yet another agency in the public safety system?
I mean, that was always a risk that you have to consider. And the balance between that and just having as a section of an existing department was that, I guess the foremost thing was that people felt that you actually needed to have a very visible step change, that people had to see that government really meant business in this, that things were really going to change. But I think there's also an importance there that that independence is really important, because these things, a lot of these regulations and enforcement actions and so on, can become very controversial. And if they're seen as being politicised in any way, then they become almost intractable to deal with properly, and you end up just deregulating because people don't like it, you know, and there's constant bickering even in the UK about, you know, PC on man and all that kind of stuff. Now, if you have an agency that is seen to be independent and making these judgments on the basis of good evidence and sound principles, then I think you've got a much better chance of it being accepted than if it's heavily within a political process. So there are risks there, and that's why we were very concerned to make sure that we tied these agencies together, not in the sense that we wanted to hamstring them, but in the sense that we wanted consistency of approach so that people could see that those principles were in practice throughout the workplace health and safety system can look like that.
One more question, Brian, and then here, and then I think probably should come to a close.
Very top down on it. Usually, ultimately,
two answers to that, Brian. One, I totally agree with you. I mean, it's almost impossible to disentangle health and safety, workplace health and safety, from, if you want to say, called the industrial relations system. And they're so closely interlinked, and that's why I belated that point a bit about tripartism and so on, because they're so closely linked. So, yes, and I don't think that until we have significantly different relationships here that some of these things will actually be properly solved. But the other side of that is, given the reality we have, what we do about it, and this is, I guess, an approach that's been used elsewhere that has had significant benefits. And we were very hesitant at looking at any one part of the system to say, look, we've just got everything right in the workplace, everything will be hunky-dory, because actually there's so many different things that interact with that.
Yeah.
Well, one is a systemic thing, that you make sure that the actions that are taken by the regulator are well evidence-based, principle-based, and well understood by the people who are affected by them. That can't be the whole answer, because I think, by and large, you might be able to correct me on this, but by and large, I think the Health and Safety Executive in the UK are a reasonable job of doing that. The second thing that I think is really important at this juncture is actually to, and it will die if it's not grabbed at this moment, is that there's a very broad awareness amongst New Zealanders about the risks, the hazards, the dangers in our health, in our workplaces. And they are willing to say, look, actually we can't go on like this, we need to change. But that will last only so long unless action is taken to maintain that awareness of those dangers. And that to me is why the public awareness campaigns that were recommended were so important. And I think the first one should be starting now, talking about why we need to set up this agency, remind them of what's happened, warning them that there may be some things here that they might like, but actually these are necessary if we're not going to go on in the old way. And if you look at the way that people's views have changed about wearing seatbelts and speeding and all those kinds of things, that a generation ago you'd have been laughed out of the room if you suggested it. These things can change with the right combination of environment, context, and interventions.
Thanks, Bill, for a very good talk and a very good discussion.